This is Fit to Succeed in partnership with NordicFitnessEducation.com with hosts Ben Pratt.
So have you ever done exercise or training without eating for several hours in a state of fasting? Well, if you have, I wonder if you've asked the questions about how does this affect our metabolism? What impact could it have on body composition? These questions and much more answered in today's podcast with Dr. Laurent Bannock, all about fasted training in context. Hello and welcome to this Fit to Succeed podcast. I'm excited today to bring you a fantastic guest who's also a podcasting colleague. It is Dr. Laurent Bannock. Dr. Bannock, it's great to have you with us.
Hey, Ben. Thank you so much for inviting me. We can call me Laurent now.
Okay, that's fine. I'm happy to call
it was an immense achievement, which I've only just received, but yeah, we call me Laurent now.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Lauren. And Lauren runs a podcast called the We Do Science podcast, one that I've listened to many times, and it usually has guests of great academic stature on as well. So, Lauren, do you want to just give us a little bit of background about yourself so that the listener knows where you're coming from? Because today's discussion is going to be a lot about context.
Yeah. So, it's funny, that podcast was something like many of us that do podcasts. It started off on I think I'm going to do a podcast. In fact, I had been a podcast on someone else's podcast, Tony Lennon on Sigma Nutrition. Mm-hmm. And I enjoyed the experience, and I thought, you know what, I wouldn't mind doing this. And because of what I was doing at the time, running, one of the things, I'm primarily a practitioner, which we'll get into in a minute, but I'm also an educator, and I run the Guru Performance Institute. We have numerous programs, including a postgraduate sports nutrition program, and we had live lectures. And what I did was sat down some of the lecturers at the end of the day and said, look, can we just sit around my laptop, let's just have a conversation, because we constantly have really interesting conversations where I'm sort of interviewing them for my own benefit. That's one of the great things about doing a podcast, is you may not have access to these top researchers, sitting in the same room as you. And, you can be a bit cheeky and contact them and say, hey, can I have an hour's chat with you? Chances are they'll be like, I'm busy. But if you do a podcast,
it makes a difference.
And that's kind of how it came about. Was it started off face-to-face with, it was Professor now, Graham Close, and now Professor James Morton. And now Dr. Scott Robinson, who also works at Group Performance part-time. And, that was such a great, awesome experience that I was genuinely just asking them stuff that I wanted to know, to draw out interpretations from the rocket science. Those guys are very applied. And that's what I'm doing, is I'm trying to take the science and apply it to practice. So I act like a translator, someone who's not just doing it for the sake of it. I'm interested in it myself, because I also work with athletes and so on. And knowing how to access and source this information from the right places, which we'll get into a bit later, is at the core of evidence-based practice.
Yeah.
So that's the great thing about the podcast for me, was I was interviewing all these people, and it became a bit of an obsession. I was doing up to 2 to 3 podcasts a week at one point.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
3-4 hours of reading of papers before I'd interview the expert. But my knowledge base increased exponentially over the course of roughly 100 episodes. So I totally burnt out and stopped recording for about a year, but that was because I was finishing my doctorate. But yeah, it was mainly for my own benefit, and I shared the experience for the listeners.
Yeah,
and it got very popular. So new series starting very soon, by the way.
Oh, I'm looking forward to that. I know I've listened to quite a few of your first 100 episodes. Although there's one or two, one with Asker Ukendrup and one with Louise Burke that I still haven't listened to, and it's on my radar. I want to hear.
Oh, wow. Those are gems. You must do.
Right up my street. Now, in the We Do Science podcast, you often refer to the idea of understanding and applying nutritional principles in context. And you often talk about the importance of context. Now, within the fitness world, I often see lots of different principles being applied, but sometimes not in context. Can you define what we mean by that?
Yeah. So If I move away temporarily, and this will be a shock horror to people who listen to me a lot, from the word context,
Okay.
and we replace that word with relevant, right? Relevant is at the core of evidence-based practice, and I'm obsessed with this because that's what my doctorate was in evidence-based practice in sports nutrition. Relevance is, you can interchange that word with context. The problem with these words is people often don't necessarily understand what they mean because they are lacking the necessary knowledge and the experience and the skills to understand when is this information relevant. So that is almost a way of summing up context is the information may be the best possible science, but it may not actually be relevant to the situation that you're in. So for example, we can all be obsessed with, is high intensity interval training superior to, steady state cardio as a means of just burning calories, getting fitter? It doesn't really matter. But the context issue is the person, i.e. some people's low intensity exercise is someone else's high intensity exercise. A very overweight, extremely unfit person, even trying to go for a 5-minute low level jog on a treadmill is seriously hard work, right?
Yeah, sure.
That's an example of context. The other thing is, if they don't even have a treadmill, what do? They may not have 2 hours to go and run around the countryside. They've only got 20 minutes. So that's what we mean by context, because invariably, I like to draw upon, actually, in philosophy and sociology, there's something known as epistemology, which essentially brings us to our beliefs. What is the source and quality of those beliefs and the justification for those beliefs? And this is where we tend to get into trouble, particularly when I cast my own mind back to when I was a PT. I didn't have as much knowledge or experience as I do now. We all have to start somewhere, which is awesome. But the problem is when you have less knowledge and experience, your ability to interpret information and context is reduced significantly. So we have a threshold of belief. We think, wow, that sounds super sciencey. Therefore, high intensity interval training must be superior to steady state, or another chat we'll get into, is fasted training, superior for fat loss or training or whatever. The problem is yes and no.
Yeah, sure. It's not clear. It's not always straightforward.
It totally depends. The problem is that people have, and I'm slightly guilty of having promoted the context thing, because I know what it means. The people I'm interviewing know what it means, but unfortunately, a lot of people don't truly understand what context is, and that's the danger of it, because the it depends thing is entirely dependent on your ability to actually see the relevance and nature of the context. And that is why education is so important, and that is why things like podcasts, continuing education development, is essential. Because if I think of my own growth and development, it's very common experience when you do a doctorate is by the end of it, you realize you know very little. It's a bizarre process. And a lot of that is knowledge is very fluid, so it evolves rapidly over time. But also what we know in the context of the greater world, the body of knowledge is almost nothing. So we have to be extremely careful with what we do and don't know. But casting myself back to 27 years is when I started, 45 now for context. And I spent a lot of that time as a PT. It was about PT for about 15 years. And, the listeners that have only been doing it for a year just graduated with a PT certificate, and those that are like me have done 10, 15 years. There's a lot of stuff you experience in that process. You don't necessarily have time to keep up with all the science. Back when I started, by the way, there were no podcasts, there was no Twitter, there was no Instagram. You guys listening, you're incredibly lucky now, but the other problem you've got is there is so much noise in terms of information. It is very difficult to know who to believe and who not to believe. And herein lies my biggest worry currently, and that is the amount of pseudo experts. There's a real trend currently of people trying to pull people down for, incorrect beliefs,
Right.
trolling, stuff like that. I don't believe this is healthy. I don't believe that it's professional, but more importantly, we need to try and help people understand. And that's why I wanted to help with this podcast, for example, is because I believe that this is a particularly good way of doing things. But our obsession with experts on Twitter and so on, these are not really experts normally. And even then it's going to be context driven with regards to what their expertise, where is it relevant, and what should you or should you not take from that information. And there's some very powerful characters that exist, particularly on social media, who are very influential, but in reality, a lot of them make me cringe, but I'm not the sort of person that likes to
Sure.
names out there. But what I would say is you need to think about information and where it's coming from. And is that person really an expert? I spent years getting into stuff that I bitterly regret. I don't regret it really now because it was all part of my growth and development. I got into all sorts of rubbish as one grows and develops one's personal training practice, which is very much in the trenches.
Yes.
It's in the real world. You've got all sorts of things that influence your day-to-day practice as a PT. You've got to make a living. You've got to get some clients. You've got to deal with difficult people. I mean, God, I'm so pleased I'm not a PT anymore. the crazy hours I used to work, which everyone will listen to. But it's also an incredibly rich and rewarding world to be in, because one thing I miss is working in elite sport primarily now, particularly as a performance nutritionist and as a physiologist. I don't get to see people anything like as often as I used to.
Sure.
And relationships is a huge part of practice. But anyway, I drifted away from that, but this is all part of the context. The practitioner is part of the context. You have to sit there and think, what is this information? Where is it coming from? Is it relevant to this situation? Do I really know how to interpret this information? Maybe I should go and find out, learn a bit more, go and ask the right people, maybe increase my referral network. These are all things that I learned how to do over time. Yeah. But at the end of the day, being a PT can be a lonely experience if you're self-employed and so on. Being a nutritionist can be very, very, isolating experience, which again is why I think podcasts and so on is good. But that's the lure of social media, is go find friends on social media. But you have to be careful, because the way in which you source information to influence your practice, your decisions, the results you try and get with your clients, like, should I do fasted training? Should I do, carb restriction and so on? It may all sound all cool and sexy, but at the end of the day, you need to make sure it's the right decisions, because that will impact your practice. And by that, I mean the health of your client, the outcomes of your client, but ultimately whether you get good results, the name of you and your reputation. Ultimately, the bottom line will be your career, your ability to make money, and your ability to progress to somewhere nice where you can buy your home one day and do that sort of thing. Very easy to kill your career.
Yeah, sure. I think you've given us some great context there, Lauren, in terms of your background, where you're coming from, and why understanding the background, understanding your client's perspective, all of those things matter when you look to apply some form of nutrition or some form of fitness advice. I'm also really pleased that you raised the topic of HIIT training versus aerobic training, because it's something over the last few years has really been prevalent in the fitness industry. And like you said, understanding the context, I think, is so important, because when you look at the research and the data around that high intensity training, a lot of it kind of spawned from Professor Tabata's work, which was done purely on bikes and cycle ergometers, where they cycle fast and slow for, those different periods of time. And then now I see HIIT training being applied to, circuit settings that have no bikes or no cardiovascular work whatsoever. And they're saying that the same results will apply. Yet there's no way somebody doing, some squats with a light barbell in a circuit studio is going to reach 170% VO2 max, which was what Tabata worked at. So like you've kind of implied, that this concept of having context to then look at the scientific evidence to know whether or not it applies to the way we want to make it work as a fitness professional.
Well, I think, Ben, you make a great point there. And I think what's important is one doesn't realize just how significant this topic is until, for example, you start doing a bit of science and you realize that, there are principles involved in order to do experiments and actually learn something from that. And that involves trying to control for errors. You're trying to control for bias. These things are very difficult to do. So what you do is you reduce the process to purify it of all these potential problems, okay? And it's very common. That's what we do in science. It's a reductionist process. The thing, though, is that what we're doing is we're reducing all of the stuff you find in the real world into a situation that does not exist, really. But what we're trying to do is learn about mechanisms to help us understand general concepts. What we're not supposed to do is reverse engineer that back to the real world and apply it literally. Right. Hence my previous example about high-intensity interval training and cardio. Yes, so Tabata's work was done a certain way because that was the environment and the resources that they had, and that was the study design that they came up with. That isn't necessarily the only way that you're supposed to do these things.
Of course.
The context situation is far more relevant here, is that the basic principle is that if you're very time limited, there are strategies that can push the physiology in a certain way, in a time-restricted fashion, using, stuff that doesn't require you to be outside or travel anywhere necessarily to get a certain result, where the outcome is improved, metabolic responses, your physiological improvements in, cardiorespiratory fitness, increasing metabolic, there's loads of benefits. The thing is, sure, you can get the same results just going for a 1 hour run, for example. Mm-hmm. There is no real advantage. The thing is that the more narrow you look at it, you're just trying to match one for the other in a nice tick box scenario. If you step back a bit further and go, well, yeah, one is only 20 minutes, one's an hour, that's the difference. Mm-hmm. Some people hate running. Some people hate, doing all out for a minute and then rest, all out for a minute. Mm-hmm. Some people only have 1 foot. Some people, hate bicycles because they hate the seats. Some people hate treadmill. There are many things. The point, though, is that if all you do is look at the evidence as it's been reduced for the purposes of science, you're missing the bigger picture issue. Mm-hmm. So what you need to do is you need to be able to learn how to read that information in the context of the bigger picture, which is why I mentioned the phrase or the word relevant, okay? The actual epistemological thought process is, I can do this, but should I? Right. Yes, you can, but should you? Right? Mm-hmm. So that's a good question. You can do it, but should you do it? And simply interrogating the question and what revolves around that, resources, time, money, preference of the client, absolutely essential. We all know that in personal training. There's so many things that we know. We know that this would be a better way of doing it, but they don't want to do it. Okay? So you adapt it. All knowledge, for us as PTs, tools are not just, weights and machines. Knowledge is a tool, right? Yeah. So that could be your strategies, it could be what you learn, supplements and so on, but they all go in the toolbox. As an expert, you need to be able to determine which tools to use and when. You need to learn how to use each tool. You need to know the limitations of each tool. Because oftentimes the real experts are the people that know when not to do something.
Yeah, sure.
The naivety of professional youth, so to speak, is that you get into something, so you just get everyone to do it. So suddenly everyone's doing, fasted cardio, everyone's, not eating carbs, everyone's doing high intensity interval training. I get it. It's enthusiasm. You want to try it. But the point is that you're not actually truly thought about, is this the only way of doing it? And therefore, is it the most relevant to what I'm trying to achieve in terms of outcomes, and is it relevant, appropriate, and practical for the person you're actually giving the advice to.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've mentioned a couple of times, Lauren, this concept of fasted training, and that's kind of the topic I want to get into. Now, similar to the ISSN, you have created a number of position statements, and one of those position statements that particularly caught my eye, because it's an area that's interesting and seems to be kind of popular at the minute, is this idea of training in a fasted state. And so you have this position statement on your Guru Performance website that's all about that. What motivated you particularly to maybe do that little bit of research with your team and to publish that statement?
Yeah, so I was very lucky in that on my team were people who had recently finished or were completing PhDs in these topics, right?
Oh, right.
So, and I do a lot of work in that area with my clients, a lot of whom are, as we mentioned, elite athletes, some of whom are elite endurance athletes, where this topic is a lot more relevant than it is to the average person. Mm-hmm. But also, I have a lab, and in my lab, I have metabolic testing equipment for assessing metabolism at rest, metabolism during exercise, what we call substrate utilization, which is simply just the fuel that is being used, fats, carbohydrates, and so on. So I'm not just, reading someone else's work or listening to a guru and saying, yes, this works. No. We have expertise. And by that, I mean people doing PhDs, publishing papers, and we actually have the equipment that is used to read and understand what metabolism is doing. So our perspective is slightly different. So the reason why we did those position stands is that they were very topical at the time, a year and a half ago now, and they were of great interest to us in our work with elite athletes, but there was very little. There were no position statements by anyone out there at the time. There was no consensus on the topic. So actually, we put these together primarily for our own benefit. One of the great things about conducting research or writing review papers and so on is it forces you to look at all of the evidence, all of the literature, everything that's out there. Mm-hmm. And because my particular research interest was in the concept of science to practice, i.e. taking the science and then filtering that to an applied context, demanded that we take a look at the information again from the lens of the practitioner looking to apply this stuff. Mm-hmm. And basically, you can all read these position stands. I think that we give a very balanced perspective. Mm-hmm. I think you do. What the evidence was up until about a year and a half ago, which is more or less the same now, which is there are benefits to fasted training, particularly for performance. For example, going for a long bike ride or a run first thing in the morning in a fasted state, and by that I mean you haven't eaten anything, particularly carbohydrates, forces the metabolic machinery to make certain adaptations, which is the marvelous thing about the body and the adaptive nature of metabolism and the plasticity of not only the tissue but the system in general, is that it will find ways of adapting to a lack of a fuel supply, right? Yep. That in itself can be a strategy. In this case, it might increase the number of mitochondrial units, it might increase metabolic signaling processes, things like PGC1 alpha. I won't bore you all with that right now. It's all sexy science, but it's not entirely relevant. You know all the rocket science. The point is that things actually happen that are beneficial. The problem is that if that's all you do, those adaptations will then become the dominant adaptation, right? I.e. you just become incredibly good at using fat as a fuel, but that can be at the expense of using carbohydrate as a fuel.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, this is where the context issue comes into play. If you are an elite endurance athlete, and by that, I'm probably going down more the ultra endurance athlete. People who
like
do
90 minutes plus, that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, no, ultra endurance, like
several hours,
five marathons in 5 days, sort of thing.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Because again, the context here is if you got someone like Mo Farah doing a marathon, he's running at a pace which is you and me be sprinting at that pace. Mm-hmm. He's still going to use a fair amount of carbohydrate. right?
Yep, sure.
Whereas most of us, if we're fit enough to run a marathon, even if we want to do it in 3.5, 4 hours, which is still a decent time, yes, we might be more interested in conserving carbohydrates for the sprint finishes, the breakaways and stuff like that. But that's because we do not have both the genetics nor the training. Lest we not forget, these guys train, all day, every day, up at altitudes. They're built like whippets. They're like, I'm 200 pounds or so, and I'm trying to be an ultra endurance athlete. Trust me, it's hard work. There's a lot of context involved there. Just because they're doing it, it doesn't mean that you should do it. But the point of just to bring us away from the rabbit hole I was almost going on, is that these adaptations should not be taken as a all or nothing approach. It is a tool in the toolbox. Yeah. Fasted training has benefits, which may also be negatives depending on the context. So this is why we now tend to talk more about periodization, or sometimes you train fasted because there's a benefit to it. Sometimes you don't train fasted because you do want the body to learn how to use carbohydrates. You do want the gut to be able to handle carbohydrates. By the way, if you just stop eating carbs, the gut also starts to lose the ability to handle carbohydrates. And guess what? When you occasionally eat carbs, you get gut problems. And then the anecdote is, oh, I don't tolerate carbs. Yeah, well, that should have happened, right? Mm-hmm. But that's a lack of knowledge that led to that scenario. You need carbohydrates your body will use carbohydrates in order to create lactate, for example. Mm-hmm. If you're not producing lactate efficiently in that manner, then you won't, the body will not be in a position to buffer the lactate, increase its buffering abilities. You won't be able to push the thresholds. Yep. But this is not relevant to somebody who just goes to a gym. So yes, unless they have real serious performance, desires, then maybe going low carb actually has some benefits, because the carbs aren't that useful to them. They probably overeat them anyway. Mm-hmm. And it's a source of calories that more than likely they need to cut the calories from somewhere. So mm-hmm. there's a useful strategy. But I think the point though is you're not just doing fasted training because you think it's the best way, because there is no best way other than what is right for the context at the particular moment in time, which is what we ultimately will conclude at the end of our position stand papers, because we also have one that relates to body composition. Mm-hmm. Yes, papers go, fasted training is not relevant for body composition. It can be, but the context is a lot broader than that simple statement. Mm-hmm.
But I do think, though, Lauren, that if I interrupt there, that the motivation for a lot of people to do fasted training is probably one of those two things. It's probably they're trying to burn more body fat because they think, because I haven't eaten, I'm going to burn more body fat. Or two, because they've read somewhere about some performance benefits of being able to utilize more fats as a fuel. So can you give some context to those two?
Well, I mean, look, it's quite simple. That getting rid of, so this is a knowledge issue, because what happens is we start using words without defining what we mean by these things, sure. Right? So are we talking about burning fat generally, or are we talking about influencing fat balance in the body? Two very different topics. So if we're not specific enough about what we're going to talk about here, it's at the expense of just basic logic, which is going to be energy balance.
So right? let's clarify those two things, because I think you're right that people probably misinterpret the science and assume anything that increases fat oxidation means that we're burning body fat. So give me some clarification there.
So look, at the end of the day, when we talk about burning fat, like on a cardio machine, it says you're in the fat burning zone, which is a fantastically misleading thing, because that's based on generalized data that isn't necessarily your fat burning zone. That's just, the mean fat burning zone in that study. Sure. That just means that during that particular activity, you're tapping into fat as a fuel. Okay, substrate utilization is primarily fat. The thing though is, what's interesting about actually doing these metabolic tests is when you're actually watching fuel utilization, substrate utilization, your body's not using only one source of fuel. You're not only using fat, or at least you're not normally only using fat. At the low levels of intensity, you should be using mostly fat. As it starts to get super high intensity, you get progressively more and more carbohydrate. But that is only an average perspective. There are many variations on what actually happens, and that does depend on, have you restricted carbohydrates? What is your metabolism actually adapted to for the norm? Okay? So there's that, but that is only what's happening in that moment. The thing there is the body will quite happily replace all of that fat in the remaining meals of the day. Okay? So the total fat balance at the end of the day may still be the same as it was before you even started the exercise, right? So this is where it gets misleading. Although you're burning more fat during the exercise, if you haven't sorted out your total daily, or more important, your total weekly energy expenditure, and we can get into the macronutrient influence, nutrient partitioning in a minute, then ultimately your body's just going to replace what it used. That's how it works. So fat balance is more relevant, and therefore increasing fat oxidation is only relevant at a very microscopic level if you've also accounted for total daily energy expenditure. But beyond that, you've also allowed for an appropriate nutrient partitioning or energy partitioning within that, which is then you have to start manipulating the amount of fat, the amount of carbohydrates, the amount of protein from the total amount of calories. It all starts to get rather complex at that point. And usually, because, as I said, metabolism is so adaptive and there's so much plasticity involved in this process, you really shouldn't be worrying about that. People, they get obsessed with this topic and they all like to cite science and so on, but that's typically because their knowledge actually isn't that great. They've got enough to get sciencey, but not enough to truly understand what it really means, particularly in the context of the bigger picture. It's super simple. It will always boil down to energy balance.
Mm-hmm.
Always.
And we're talking energy balance across longer durations, not just right now because I'm in the gym and I'm training. We're talking about
yes,
over
because
time.
you don't exist for 1 minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes. You exist for decades, hopefully, preferably many decades. So again, when you look at science, some studies are done just using indirect calorimetry, which is quite good, but it's still only really a snapshot. Some studies are done just with energy equations, which is real dangerous territory because that's just formulas and basic information, which is what most people will use when they talk about this stuff. Sometimes there's metabolic ward studies, so it's more controlled within a clinical environment, but the really interesting studies are the ones that are done in calorimetry chambers, 24-hour calorimetry. So it's not indirect, it's direct. So for example, Dr. Scott Robinson, who works for me or is involved with us at Good Performance, he did his PhD in fat metabolism for health and performance, for example. I think he was the primary author in that particular paper in fasted training and exercise performance. And, both of them actually. And what they were doing was the gold standard testing of what actually happens in a 24-hour period.
Right, I see.
You learn very different things from looking at the whole day than you do from an isolated 1-hour workout. And this is the danger, is there's all these wars going on social media and they're saying, this study said that this type of exercise has but that was done using incredibly basic equipment in a snapshot of a day. No, you need to do this in a much more complex manner, using things like metabolic ward studies. You need, chamber studies. They're very difficult to do. There's going to be so few of these things. So the point is we don't quite know yet.
Yes.
So this brings us back to the information informs our decision making, but we need to understand the limits of what this knowledge is and bring it back to the real world and go, at the end of the day, it's still going to be energy balance. It's still going to be what's relevant for them, because if it's relevant for them, and by that I mean it's got to work, so you don't want the calorie deficit to be too extreme, but it's very difficult working out what actually is their current level of intake and output, because you don't know. If you're on Excel working stuff out, you don't know what their energy expenditure is. You go on about NEAT and PALs and so, but that's someone else. That's all. Yes, it's from science, but it isn't yours. So
it's
you're guessing
approximations of the population.
Yeah. So if you spend a little bit less time on that and a little bit more time on the practical stuff, like habit and behavior modification, what are they actually eating and drinking? You need to ask yourself, why is this person overeating chronically? Because it's got nothing to do with what they did yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
It has got everything to do with what they've been doing for the last 3-4 months.
Mm-hmm.
Often that comes back to a bigger picture issue. And that's why, again, PTs are in a great place because they get to learn, is this guy stressed? What are the drivers? What are the mechanisms behind this overfeeding? The reason why I'm mentioning this is because if you think you're being so precision with your science, which actually you're not, because unless you've got your chamber, direct calorimetry chambers, you actually don't know what you're doing, not really. But what you are doing is that is at the expense of understanding what the actual problem is. Why are these people doing these things?
Mm-hmm. I wonder, Lauren, because we're almost coming up on time here, and I'd like to, yeah, that's it's gone quick, hasn't it? I'd like to just really get specific for a minute, because my feeling of the personal training industry and this concept of fasted training is that most people are looking at the concept of, I haven't eaten all night, my client's with me in the morning, and I want to know what benefit there is to them doing a training session without eating, and then they eat after the session. So is there any truth to, for example, the concept of that it will increase their fat oxidation if they train in a fasted state?
Right. So there's a yes and no to that, because it will be an individualized answer, of course. Mm-hmm. But basically, if someone's training first thing in the morning, yes, they're fasted. I think it's less about what are the physiological benefits of fasted training is basically irrelevant to the average person. Okay. What's more relevant is the consequences of it. Okay. If they still need to cut calories out of their diet, and they're still going to be hitting the bottle of wine at night and so on, the simple fact that they're doing fasted training is a tool in your toolbox to get them to avoid eating something before the training, which is removing calories from their diet. If they eat before, they're going to eat after. It's just one of those things. So it can be a tool in the toolbox. Good. The other side, though, is if they're not eating, they may not train as well. And if they don't train as well, they're not going to get the adaptations. They won't enjoy the session as much. So there's consequences to that.
So perceived exertion tends to be higher if they haven't eaten.
Exactly. So the point I think here is you have, it's on a case-by-case basis that you answer this question. And it's like I said, you can, but should you? Because you say, can we make this specific? I can't, because the whole point is that it's not a generalized question and answer. It's a depends. So read the position stands, do your research on the topic, but always reduce it down to I can do this, but should I do this?
Yeah, and we'll definitely link to your position stand in the show notes of this episode. Two little things just to add to this, and then we'll conclude. Firstly, is there any difference that you're aware of in the science between genders in fasted training? And can we summarize the difference in how fasted training would affect an untrained individual versus a trained individual? So can we summarize that in 2 minutes?
I can summarize it in a few seconds for you, in that there are very few studies on this so far that differentiates gender. The problem with studying females is it's very difficult to reduce them to a scenario where you're not being influenced by menstruation. And that makes life a nightmare, because menstruation does affect oxidation. There is like 1 or 2 papers out there that suggest that there might be differences, but it is not enough information to be able to understand how to answer that question. So the point is we don't know. If we keep it simple, we're all human beings. We essentially function the same way, right? So yes, there are benefits to fasted training. There are those physiological adaptations that we've discussed, but in the context of the bigger picture, they are incredibly small.
Right.
So for the average person, they're not relevant. They're really, really not relevant, okay? Because people love to talk about the science of this, but the science is not valuable to you if you cannot apply this with relevance into practice. Otherwise, people just get obsessed with fasted training. This is why this topic is so popular. So I see my role here is just introducing a bit of sense to the scenario and going, just hang on, think about what we're even talking about here. Is this even relevant? 9 times out of 10, no.
Right, I'm with you. But in the performance field where there may be tiny benefits to be had, it's relevant.
it's particularly relevant. So the longer the distance the athlete has to travel, i.e. ultra endurance, is probably a lot more relevant.
Right, I see.
Okay. So for those that are not so, increasing the number of mitochondria, for increasing substrate utilization in favor of fat for a 100-meter sprinter, for a weightlifter, I'm going to argue that's probably not so relevant. Is it relevant to a CrossFit athlete, a really serious one? Probably not, although they're obsessed by this sort of thing. The other thing, though, is you can take two people, one can do it one way, one can do it the other, and they can both still be as good as each other. Why? Because the body is mind-bogglingly adaptive.
Indeed. Hey, Lauren, that has been such a fascinating discussion. I get the impression we could have carried on for quite a bit longer this
Well, I've been deliberately difficult in my answers, Ben, because I'm trying to force the epistemology of you can, but should you?
And I think that's really come across, that we really need to weigh up that context. And we'll link to all of the things we've discussed about in the show notes. It's been really fascinating. Thanks so much for your time today.
No, I'm very pleased to have had a chance to be on the other side of the microphone. So thank you, Ben.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share via social media. You can also rate the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube. If you'd like to know more about us, then check out our range of online courses at www.nordicfitnesseducation.com.